So good evening, everyone. So I'm Dr. Tarel Ike, and today I'm going to be speaking about navigating the publishing landscape. The session is envisaged for around 45 minutes to an hour, so I would leave a lot of time for question and answer for any pressing question anyone would have. So just a brief one on introduction of myself. Um, I'm a senior lecturer based at Teesside University here in the UK, and I'm currently the course leader for the MA International Relations, including the applied routes. So my research interest obviously spans around de-radicalization, countering violence, extremism, international peacekeeping, and also peacekeeping within a local context. And I draw a lot from interdisciplinary perspective in my approach to the way in which I conduct my research and my work. That's why you would see that some of my publication spans around not just the international relations discipline, but also other disciplines like criminology and even psychology. Okay, so I'm currently the associate editor of the Behavioral Sciences of Terrorism and Political Regression, and also for trends in organized crime. And also outside our discipline, the BMC Public Health, just because of the nature of the kind of work that I do. So I kind of wear a multidisciplinary hat. Okay, so I've published in several outlets, both within the discipline and also beyond. So those are examples of some of the work that I have published as a lead author. There are quite a lot, but just a few ones there. For example, I've published in journals like Third World Quarterly, Behavioral Sciences, Criminology and Criminal Justice, Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflicts, Journal of Asian and African Studies, African Identities, to mention but a few. So let's get on to the session. So that's just a brief background about myself. So in terms of the session, the way I've sort of structured it is to make it quite relatable, so not too serious or academic, the way academic seriousness is. I sort of make it a bit simple and easy to follow. So I'll start off with the introduction and sort of talk about why do we need to publish? Why do we need to bother about publishing? There are other ways of sharing our research. It does not necessarily mean I have to write a 4-star paper or 3-star paper. So why is it important that we publish our work, especially using journal outlets as one of the mechanisms of disseminating our work? So I'll talk a bit around that and also around the publish or perish debates that has been from time immemorial, way before I was even born. So, and still remain somehow implicitly. And then I'll also talk about targeting the appropriate journal for your research. So it's not just enough to have a groundbreaking research or a very interesting piece of work that you might have written. How do you target the appropriate journal outlets within which you can then disseminate this work to reach the targeted audience that you're trying to reach? And then another aspect is the peer review process. What goes on behind the scene when you're thinking about submitting your paper for publication? So having that insight into what goes on behind the scene is also very, very important as well. And then I will talk about managing expectations. So whilst publishing is also a great idea, how do we manage the expectation, especially when it comes to rejection? Because that's one aspect of the academic career I found a lot of rejection in. Of course, we do get rejection in grants and other aspects, but with publication, it's not even as far as I am to this extent. I still get that journal that you submit a piece of paper to, and they don't just like it. And they could tell you, oh, sorry, we've published too much in this area, I'm not interested. So dealing with those rejection and keeping up the momentum. So I'll talk a bit around that. And also open the forum for question and answer, where if you've got any question you want to ask, I will be able to answer you. Or if I can't, but I'll just do my best to answer within the remit of what I know, because I'm not claiming to know everything. Yep. Okay, so the publish or perish landscape. Why do we even bother to publish? It's already a process to do the research in the first place, but it's also a different ballgame altogether when we want to think about publishing. So why publish? There are tons of reasons why publishing is encouraged. Again, there are different forms of means within which you can disseminate your work. So it does not necessarily mean that it has to be through a journal article. But the context in which I'm coming from is from the academic context, because I know some of us here are early career researchers that will be really keen to want to get their work out there, especially if you're in the process of completing your PhD or have completed your PhD or doing a postdoc. You might want to get some of those great work you've done out there, which I would strongly encourage. Part of the reasons is the need to share knowledge. So it's not just enough to do a beautiful piece of work. What can we learn from that piece of work that could help shape our thinking around that discipline? What can we learn from that piece of work that can help us sort of change our practice or inform policies that relates to the specific subject matter that you've gone through the time and energy to do the work on. And then again, we can also think of it from the context of career opportunities. So we are, again, the academic landscape is obviously in, I don't know how to describe it at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainties. Publishing, especially for early career researchers, is really, really encouraged because that would also stand you out from the crowd. So it's not just enough these days to get a PhD. How do you demonstrate that you can disseminate the knowledge from that PhD thesis beyond, for example, your external or internal examiners to the broader academic community or scientific community, as the case may be? So, from the context of career opportunities, it is often encouraged that you've got that publication track record to boost your profile. And then I also find that, again, from my own lived experience, that publishing do foster collaboration. So a lot of the work that I've done, one of the ways in which we have strengthened that collaboration is through the joint work we do together, whether that's in the form of writing a manuscript together as a team and then publishing to show that team work and all of that. So that's also a very important reason, which is often taken for granted, that I would suggest is encouraged to publish. In our discipline, there's tendency to have sole author paper, but again, we begin to see a shift towards collaboration, multidisciplinarity, and all of that sort of thing. And then providing information, very, very key of what has been done before, what gaps remain, and all of that. If people are not publishing, how do we know what has been done before and what remains to be done? So publication does provide that insight to see the length of work and the breadth of work that has been done and what gaps remain. And then for professional reasons as well, again, from my lived experience, I've write a lot of grants, and then you get, for example, one of the feedback, if they manage to give you a feedback these days, telling you that, oh, you do not seem to demonstrate that you've got that record on that topic, because obviously they're trying to refer to the fact that they haven't seen you publish in that area. So even if you've sort of, especially the big brands, I've begun to notice that if you're going to apply for a certain grant, if they see that you haven't got a track record, that again, that's not to say you might not get it, but again, they tend to look at that to some extent. And I've had the privilege of reviewing for other funders, and one of the criteria would be, has the applicant demonstrated sufficient knowledge in that area, e.g. through publications and all of that. So it's not just enough to know the literature of other people. They still want to see behind the scene that you actually own the grips of the work that you claim that you are an expert in. So where are some peer-reviewed publications to show that you know the stuff you're talking about? So again, supporting grant applications will be one reason I would also encourage why we publish. And then also importantly as well is informing decision making, especially at policy level. So for example, if a specific policy within the international relation context isn't working, how do policymakers make that informed decision from a scientific perspective? Again, they sometimes draw on the incredible work that colleagues across the world, both within the UK and globally, are doing to inform their practice. So you see, it's really, really important because it does, to some extent, have impact way beyond just the mere sake of publishing. So informing decision making could also be part of the reasons why we publish. Okay. Okay, so again, I'd like to make a disclaimer because at this stage, I don't want people to think that the journal is the only way to publish because I do understand we've got audience, not just within the context of academic discipline, but beyond as well. So there are various dissemination outlets. So I'm not trying to undermine any of these outlets because for me, I think all aspects of dissemination is important. So I don't tend to privilege one over the other. I publish in outlets like The Conversation. It all depends on the audience as well. So there are various outlets that you can disseminate your work. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a journal. But the purpose of today's session is just focusing on journal. There are outlets like, for example, blog posts, podcasts, conferences, workshops, through books and all of that, that you can disseminate your work. And like I said, all aspects are as important as actually publishing in a journal. It just depends on the audience and what you're trying to target. Okay, so now into the core of today's session, navigating the publishing landscape. So how then do we sort of navigate this publishing landscape? So for me, I think that one of the ways to do this is to think of it as a journey. Of course, it's not necessarily a linear journey. And what I'll be talking to you about today might not. So for some of you that already have that publishing experience, you might find that there is a slight difference in how you go about it. But I'm talking about the way in which I have approached it from my own lived experience and how it has worked. So don't feel that it's a set on stone model that I'm sort of talking to you about, feel free to disregard the part that you think, oh, actually, I can do it the other way around. So it's just the way I've done it, and I've found it's really, really helpful. So I like to think about it as a journey right from when you have that idea of the manuscript that you're going to be working on through to selecting the specific journal that you're interested in, and also going through that process of actually writing the manuscript, formatting it to the journal template, submitting it, getting feedback, whether that's accept, which is quite rare to get a straight accept, or revise and submit, whether that's major or minor revisions, or whether that's, for example, a reject, which we do tend to get, which a lot of the times it's quite normal as well. So it's about that process, that journey as well. So I like to see it as a journey or more like a process. So this is just a key outline of what that process look like. And I'll be talking about each of those points as we go. So it's about the research idea, which for me, I think is really, really important because that in itself does have an integral role to play in terms of, for example, the outlets that you would choose. That is also very crucial. And it's also about identifying the appropriate journal. What is that vehicle that you want to use to convey the message? So, who are the target audience that you're trying to reach out to? So, for example, especially within the medical field, there are some audience that are targeted at, for example, clinicians, or for example, those that are engaged in clinical practice. So those type of articles could be directed to them through those specific journal. And I learned that a lot as an associate editor for the BMC Public Health, because then you could then see the way in which certain papers are directed at certain audience. Or it could well be that it's for the broader academic community or more for audience that could be practitioners that are interested in the type of work that you're doing. So that again would determine the type of journal that you would go to. And not just that as well, the research idea could also influence whether or not you're going for a journal that accepts purely empirical research or for a journal that accepts theoretical type of research. So it's quite really, really important when we're looking at that process. And then identifying the journal, very, very key. And one thing I do notice as an associate editor during my time is, and even up to now, is that sometimes you get to see journals that are being submitted, and you could tell that the author didn't really think through the process. And they were just like, you know what, I'll just submit and see how things goes. For me, time is very, very precious. And one of the things I would encourage people to do as much as possible, especially if you're interested in publishing, is to take out the time to select the appropriate journal, because that would save you the misery of having to submit a paper and have it dex reject. That means the time you spend submitting it on average, it takes, depending on, so if it's a single author paper, it would take you like 20 to 30, even up to an hour, depending on how far you've gone to go through that submission process, depending on your speed. So it saves you a lot of time to go through that just to have it rejected. So what's the point? So it's really, really important to be familiar with the journal and to see if the idea or the central argument of your paper is what they're trying to look for in terms of, for example, the scope of the journal and the focus of the journal. And then I'll talk about things like following the journal instructions. Gradually, we're beginning to see some journal accepting open formats, like they don't mind the type of references that you use and things like that. So they might accept it when you first submit. And then if eventually they accept your paper or your manuscript, then you can then format it to the template. We'll gradually begin to see that. But we still have the traditional journals that would require you to follow their template. So for example, they would require you to write a certain number of words in the abstract. They can restrict you to 150 words, 200 words, and all of that. So if you go beyond that, that automatically would be sent back to you if they like your idea or just disreject straight away. So, and then I'll talk about understanding the decision process, what happened behind the scene when you submit the paper, what does that mean, and how can you navigate that? So if you have that knowledge of both sides of the coin, it puts you at a more advantageous position when you're going through this landscape. Okay, and then revising paper. Of course, we always have the odd reviewer too that gives you one of the hardest feedback. How do you respond to it in a more pragmatic and constructive way without taking it personal, and then review and proof that when it's been accepted? That's quite like a straightforward process. Okay. Uh, okay. So the research idea. So for me, I think this is sometimes considered the preliminary stage. So before you even think of actually publishing in a journal, you must have had some sort of, or you one might have had some sort of idea that they want to write up into a manuscript and then publish, as the case may be. And for me, I think that's the starting point to start to think through carefully, where would you want this idea to go to? A lot of the times it could be a fleeting idea. You're not yet like set on, okay, what am I going to do with this idea? And I get that a lot from, for example, my PhD students who um, are interested in publishing, for example, but they're not quite clear, okay, what aspect of my thesis am I going to publish? It's like an 80,000 word document. How do I condense that to 8,000 words? For some journals, I know some journals give around 10,000 words, even some up to 11 to 12,000. How do I condense that 80,000 word? I've got this big idea into a single journal article. So that could be something that can impact the choice of journal that you would want to go to. So are you looking at giving a much, much more depth around the topic? Some would limit you to 7 to 8,000 words, whereas others would give you around 12,000 words. So thinking about that would be something that would be crucial at that stage. So one thing I would say is about keeping it simple. I know a lot of the time, sometimes you might want to put in a lot of like, okay, I've got this idea, I've got that idea all into one paper. But a rule of thumb that I have that I've used consistently is that I'd rather have one main theme in my paper and devote a robust, in-depth analysis to that theme than have multiple different themes that is quite superficial. So it's about having one or two central ideas, focus on it in much, much more depth to make a coherent contribution and addition to the literature than having, let's say, 5, 6, 7 different themes or trying to be forced upon one paper. That in itself would even lead the paper to be rejected straight away. And then once you've got that idea that you're trying to address, another important aspect would be to be consistent on how you tread that idea. I call it the golden thread. So when we're doing our PGC, they taught us about the golden thread in teaching, but I also do apply it to writing papers as well. So let the idea be reflected not just in the abstract, but also in the introduction and conclusion. So for example, we do get a lot of submission, and one of the things we do is to first of all look at the consistency in the argument that the author is making. We look at the abstracts. That's not to say we don't look at the entire paper, but just the first impression. What does the abstract say that the authors claim to be that they're going to be doing? And then what does the methods say? What does the introduction say? Is there a constructive alignment between the abstract, the introduction, the methods, and the conclusion? So if that is not consistent, that obviously there's no need wasting your time and my time. That definitely. So if we do like the paper, we would always recommend the author to, for example, if they're willing to revise it, but that's quite rare, or a lot of the time, or sometimes we might say, this is not a good fit, sorry. So it's really, really important that you have that clear idea that constructively aligns with the introduction, the abstracts, and the conclusion, as the case may be. And then again, I'm just trying to, there's a lot to cover, but I'm just trying to look at the time so I don't go over there. Okay, so again, the research idea, one way I tend to find it useful in to make sure the research idea is something that is worth writing into a paper or a manuscript, as the case may be, is to discuss it with close peers. And again, that's something that is encouraged because once you do discuss it with your peers, what then happens is that they could help you refine that idea. So, for example, if you've got a manuscript you want to work on, you might want to discuss it with your supervisor. So, your supervisor might be familiar with the work, but I'll try to recommend like someone that is not necessarily within your discipline. If you can't explain the idea in two sentences, then it might mean that you need to go back and refine it. So that's something I normally do with my papers as well. I just have a short pitch of the idea. And we learned that when we were doing our PhD, the 3 minutes challenge. So talk about the work in two sentences, or if it's something that you're really keen to work on, you can do it a 3 minute speech around the topic. What is it you want to do? Why do you want to do it? And all of that. If you can't talk about it in 3 minutes and the other person doesn't get the message, then it might be worth you going back to refine it as well. So have that critical friend or colleague that could you could have this type of conversation with that will help you to refine it, because few papers are accepted without revisions. So I know there are some papers that when they're published, when they're submitted, they get accepted. But from my experience, they're very, very few. Like they must be absolutely great. So one of the ways to avoid that would be to have this constructive feedback from your close colleagues or friends that you've been working with, and that would help like with the review process. So you've already started your own review of your ideas and your process and your papers even before you actually start. So that gives you a stronger edge when you're writing the paper. Okay, so in terms of the research idea, it's also important to think about the publication strategy. So for me, one thing I normally do is I have top 3 journals for a specific piece of paper I'm going to be submitting. So I'll have my first best choice that this is my target journal. But let's say, for example, they reject it for some reason best known to them, regardless of everything I do. What is the next journal I will be targeting? And then what's the third journal? So I always have 3 journal at the back of my mind whilst I'm preparing my manuscript, because that would help me to, that's why I said the whole essence of this is to equip you with that knowledge in advance so you don't get discouraged. Because I've seen situations, especially with some of my colleagues, where they've written some papers, it got rejected, and then they just shelve it. So how do you prevent that in the first place? Because rejection is definitely normal in the process. Okay, and then think about authorship as well. So again, I like to do this earlier on because that would help with how we can come together as a team. I tend to publish a lot of collaborative paper. How we can come together to divide up the section based on each of our strengths. Because, for example, I might have a colleague that is an expert in methodology, Whilst, for example, I might be an expert in doing the literature review because I've been engaged in a lot of systematic review in the past. So we complement each other. But if it's a sole author paper, you don't need to worry about that step because you're just writing it by yourself. But like I said, we'll begin to see a transition into multidisciplinary research. And again, that seems to be something that is quite encouraged by the ref as well. Okay, so the next step, let's say you've figured out your idea, you're now sure that actually you want to write it up for publication. Then what's the next thing to do? So one thing I would say again is that it's not enough to have a brilliant piece of work. What is crucial is about the journal outlet that you want to be the voice for that piece of work, where you can actually showcase that work to reach the audience that you're targeting. So one key question that normally comes up is when exactly do I need to start thinking of identifying the appropriate journal for my research? I would say start early. And for me, it's before you actually start writing the manuscript. So recall what I said about once your ideas have been crystallized, think about what journals would most likely like the type of work that you're trying to publish. So one of the ways to do that is having a preliminary reading on around the topic, which I believe you would have done, because for you to even think of writing the paper, of the idea in the first place, you might have done a brief scoping review to see what's out there and what gap you intend to fill. So it's about thinking about that specific top three journals that you're interested in. So again, that would mean that you would have then made the decision as to which specific journal you want to go to. So another time to do that is after the results have been fully published. So for example, if you're doing empirical research, you can't start, you can actually, but for me, I would not start thinking about a journal yet until after I've completed the research. Because what's the point when you've not even completed the research or you don't even know if you would complete the research? So that would be like, for me, not a good use of time. But again, like I said, it's not a linear process, but that's what I've done in the past. I wait for all my data to have been collected. And then that is when I know for certain that no new findings is emerging beyond the data that I have at hand. So then I can start thinking, okay, what outlet do I think is the most appropriate one for this specific research that I'm going to be writing or for the specific manuscripts I'm going to be working on? Again, it's also after you've decided what journal you want to go for. So again, is it a Q1 journal? Is it a Q2 journal? So that's the journal ranking. Is it a 4-star journal, a 3-star? What type of journal do you want to go to? So it's not all paper that would go to a 4-star. There is no point like saying all paper must fit into a 4-star. So it all depends on what the kind of work you've done and what you're aiming for. That's not to say that you can't aim for a 4-star journal, like the top ranking journal. You can, obviously, but it's just managing that expectation. If it's just a mere like not sorry, a simple type of paper where you're just trying to probably argue some points or all of that sort of thing, then obviously you might want to you might be thinking about okay, medium or low impact journal, so to say. But like I say, it's up to you. You might want to still target the high impact journal, but they do have their threshold of the quality of work that they will want to get in there anyway. So just not to waste your time, because you might do that and they will still reject it that, oh, this is not of sufficient quality to go there. So it's about after you've made that decision, okay, am I going for a high impact journal or low impact or medium impact? Then you can start thinking carefully about the specific journal outlets that you want to use. Okay. So how do you actually then select the appropriate journal? For me, I think one of the ways to do this is to think about who is the target audience for this manuscript I'm writing. Is it for practitioners? Is it for just the academic communities? Or who exactly is the person that I want the message from this article to reach out to? So that would inform whether or not you're going to be going for a specialist journal or a journal that sort of disseminate their work to the general public, because the writing style will definitely be different depending on which journal you're going to. And then turnaround time. I cannot overemphasize this a lot. I would encourage you to look at the journal turnaround time, because in the past I have experienced a journal that took, of course, we do know that there is a shortage of peer reviews and then backlogs and things like that. But again, that would help because there are some journals that you'd submit your paper to a year, 2 years, your paper is still there. By the time you get back, they get back to you, your argument is quite dated. I've experienced that in the past. So depending on your level of patience, so you need to think about, okay, am I ready to wait for that long before the journal tells me whether or not they like my paper? What is their peer review process like? So some of the journals, especially the Taylor and Francis one, they normally put on the journal the average time that you get a response. Then you can then have that time at the back of your mind. And if you submit your paper and then it's past the time frame, then you can actually email the editor to say what is what's going on, and then they can actually chase up reviewers or do something about the situation. But don't just submit without actually knowing the time frame. Very, very important. You don't want to write a paper, submit it to a journal that is just there 2, 3 years, arguments dated, and then by the time they get back to you, a lot of things have moved on, and then you now have to go about doing major rewrites and things like that. So very, very important. And then there is the other one as well, the APC, which is the article processing charge. So for some journals, they don't charge this APC. So it's up to you if you want your journal to be open access, or again, if it's open access, you'll have wider readership and things like that. Whereas if it's based on institutional subscription, then that would limit the readership of your journal. Because if, for example, especially in third world countries, like for example, Nigeria, where not some of the institutions don't have that subscription, then of course you're limiting a broad segment of people that would not have access to your work to be able to read your work, and that would diminish the impact, so to say. So you need to think about this. And if there is an APC charge, is your institution willing to pay the APC charge? Because you don't want to submit a paper and then it comes back that you need to pay that APC out of your pocket. So these are things you need to do before you even think of picking a specific journal. Okay, so again, when you're identifying the appropriate journal, one other thing I would say as well would be to put yourself in the shoe of the journal or the editors. So this is one thing I do consistently. So not just when I'm writing a journal, even when I'm writing a grant, I swap sides. So if I am the reviewer of this grant, will I be willing to part my money for this research? Is it convincing enough? So just put yourself on the shoe of the editor of the journal and say, if I'm the editor of the journal, will I be willing to actually want this work to be published in my outlets? So once you swap that space, you begin to think more openly and begin to say, for example, oh, this is an area I can improve on to make this more acceptable to your target journal. So again, what are the editors or journal looking for? So one of the things typically as for example, an editor, for example, that I would look at would be, for example, the novelty of the manuscript. So what is important about this manuscript that I would want it to be published in my journal? That's quite a normal thing that you would expect. And again, another thing that I'll be looking at is does the manuscript appeal to the broad interest of those that typically read that journal? So they would want to know about these things. And again, the way in which you write your abstract, the way in which you convey the message would go a long way to determine whether that is the case, because I have seen situations where there are really good research, but it's not been conveyed really, really clearly. So it makes it quite difficult to make that decision. And at some points, we do recommend suggestions that the reviewer, sorry, the authors might take on board if they still want to pursue the manuscript, because I tend to not want to reject manuscript unless it's absolutely bad or it doesn't align with the journal scope and things like that. So looking at ways in which the manuscript appeals to the broad interests would be something that as a prospective author you'd want to look at as well. Will it stand up to peer review? So how has the article been written? And that peer review process is really, really important. That's why, again, that's something that distinguishes a journal from like a blog post, because anyone can write a blog and just post it up there. But with journals, it does go through that peer review process. I'm not talking about predatory journals. I'm talking of real good journals we do have that double-blind peer review process. So we already know that a lot of these reviewers do it for free for their time. So to make sure that we are making the most of the reviewer's time, we ourselves, as associate editor, we do look at the paper to say, we just stand up to peer review. So if we see the flaws that there's a lot of flaws, there's no point sending it out to peer review. At that stage, we can desk reject or recommend some changes if the authors are willing to do them. And then another thing we do think about is it original? Is this an original piece of research that advances the field in some way? Or is this just a regurgitation of what we already know around the topic? So again, thinking carefully around this would help a lot. And is this an active area of research? So for example, is the research speaking to ongoing situations or debates within the international relation landscape, for example, or is it just, so that's not to say historical research are not being considered. Of course they have, but to what extent is this area important? So again, advancing the field in some way. So even if it's historical, what value or knowledge does this add within the historical context? And then clear and concise English, because so again, there might be journals that you can publish in different languages, but I'm just talking about because more of the work that I do are actually written in English. So how has the manuscript been written? Is it in a way that is clear and concise? Can I make sense of it by reading it, or do I need to get someone else to? So things like that. So it's about writing it simple and clear as well, avoiding academic jargons. Okay. And then the next step would be to follow the journal instructions. So once you've identified the journal, you've written the manuscripts, you're good and ready to, or are in a position to want to submit. Another thing you would want to look at is the journal instructions because it's really, really key because that's the signature label of the journal. Because if it hasn't got an instruction, for example, then it can't be just anything goes, as the case may be. So some of the instructions could be things like word counts. So if a journal say, for example, that manuscript is expected not to exceed 8,000 words, and then you're submitting the 12,000 words, you already know what that is. So it's like dead on arrival. So if you submit that piece of work, you do know what you're going to get. If they like the idea so much, they might tell you to condense it. Otherwise, it will just be a straight dex reject. And then again, you might want to think about empirical, whether what the work that you're doing is empirical or, for example, experimental research. Because, for example, if the work that you're doing is empirical, there are some journals that are quite strict on what they want. So some journals would say we only publish empirical work. We don't want theoretical work or things like that. So if your work is empirical, it's not empirical, then there is no point submitting to a journal that outrightly tells you from the start that we are not looking for theoretical work. So I'll give you an example on the screen. We want work that are empirical or that test some sort of experiment. There is no point going to that journal because you already know the decision from the beginning, which is why it's really, really important to follow the journal instructions. And then again, some could tell you the kind of structure that they want. So, for example, introduction, the body of the manuscript that you're trying to submit. Some can have that as well. Again, that will be really, really important for you to follow. So make sure that you have that coherent write-up of the manuscript and alignment with the journal aims and scope. And then referencing style. So for some journals, like I said, we'll now begin to see a gradual shift in format-free submission where you can actually use a specific referencing style of your choice insofar as you're consistent. And then if it's gone through the peer review process, it's been accepted, then the journal can then say, okay, this is now time for you to format it to the style that they want. And then again, because we operate, for example, like the double-blind peer review process, so you might have some journals that will tell you to submit two different forms of manuscripts, one with the author details and the other one that removes everything about the author or anything that would help identify the author. So we've seen situations where manuscript has been submitted, doesn't comply with the double-blind review process, and we then have to send it back to the authors to do the anonymization before we send it out for peer review. That's if it meets the journal guidelines as well. And then some journals will ask you to write a cover letter. So that letter essentially is trying to get a sense of what is it that is so special about your manuscript that you think is a good outlet for that you think our journal is a good outlet for it. So it's an opportunity for you to show the strengths of the paper, what is original about the paper, and what benefits it does have in terms of advancing the knowledge and the journal readership and things like that, on how it sort of ties in with the ongoing debates that has been published in the past in the journal. So it's a good opportunity to do that. So the other aspects as well would be to, sorry. The other aspects as well would be to understand the decision process. So once you've submitted the paper, it comes to us, we look at it as it being in line with the scope of the journal. That's the first thing we look at. Look at the abstract, the introduction, the conclusion. If it does look like, oh, it's something that we might be interested in. For me, I speak for myself, for example, I would go on to read a significant portion of the manuscript to get a sense of whether there is a constructive alignment of the literature with the theoretical framework or whatever it is the author is relying on, and whether there is, because there is no point wasting peer review time if just by me looking at it, it's not aligning well. So why would I send it out for peer review for 3, 4, 5, 6 months just for you to get the same decision that would come back from the peer reviewers? So we do look at that. If I think, oh, for example, this paper does have some strength, and I don't just want to desk reject straight away. We can get other members of the editorial team to look at the same piece of work and make that informed decision. So one of the common reasons for desk rejects would be if the manuscript, for example, it's not in line with the journal scope, aims, and objectives. And also, for example, if again, there's a major flaw that we think it's not something that could be rectified. So, for example, if there is a methodological flaw, how do you correct that when you've already done the research? So things like that could lead to a Dex reject straight away. But like I said, the common one is the manuscript being submitted to a journal that is not the right fit for that manuscript or for that topic. So that is a typical rejection that you can not you the whoever is submitting the manuscript can get, and then accept, very, very rare. Even in my own work, the few it's I can say it's a couple of times I've submitted a paper and I just got it accepted. A lot of sometimes it does come back, no matter how polished I write it, to say we don't like this bit of the arguments and that feedback and that feedback. So acceptance there, it's not to say it doesn't exist, it does, but it's not a lot of the time that you would get that straight acceptance. So just manage the expectations so you don't feel bad. And then there is a revise and submit. So once it's gone out for peer reviews and the peer review is favorable, sometimes it could be a minor revisions depending on the length of the review and the depth of the review, or sometimes it could be a major revision, which would mean, for example, rewriting a significant portion of the manuscript. So again, this is some of the decisions that goes behind the scene when you submit the paper. Or it can actually still go to peer review and be rejected. I've seen that a lot of the time. So we might like a manuscript, send it out for peer review, and then the peer review comes back with very negative comments. And those comments, if they're constructive in itself, in terms of the quality of the manuscript, its methodology, and things like that, then we might, for example, reject it, or sometimes it can be rejected. I've seen some really good journals that would reject a paper, give you the developmental feedback as to why they reject it, and even go a step further to suggest other potential journals that you can submit the revised version to, which for me, I think is quite great. So they give you that feed forward. So it's not like they just reject it, but they give you some developmental feedback that you can build on and then submit it to somewhere else. Again, so I know one of the key questions would be, what are some of the decisions that are influencing this? So these are influenced by several factors. But for me, I think one of the key ones that I've noticed consistently, regardless of the journal I've worked with, is the peer review advice. So let's say you've met all of the journal requirements, the arguments is great, and it's within the scope of the journal, and we sent it out for peer review. One of the things that I've noticed is that the peer review advice greatly influenced the decision as to whether or not the manuscript is being accepted or rejected. And then other aspects would be the editors or editorial team decisions. And also, for example, amounts of space in the journal or other underlying factors. So, for example, if we've got a lot of research on or a lot of publication on a specific topic which has been significantly covered, and then you're sending in a manuscript that does not really add anything beyond what we already know, that again would influence the decision to reject the manuscript. So it's not necessarily that your argument or the way you write it isn't great, it's just that we've got a lot of other authors that have published within that space, and what you're adding is not necessarily different from what they've said before. So then that would obviously inform the decision to reject. Okay, so why is understanding this decision process important? So one thing I would say is about managing expectations, because not everyone have that resilience to keep going and trying on something again and again and again and get that rejection. But if you do know about this from the onset, it helps build you up to say, regardless of whether or not it's rejected, every journal, every manuscript has got home. I can always try somewhere else. So it does help in you managing that expectation as well. And it also helps in your decision making. So, for example, if a journal were to give you a major revision and you don't quite agree with, for example, what the reviewers are saying, then you can make that informed decision to withdraw your paper. So it's not mandatory that you must revise and submit. The ultimate decision is just whether or not you want to go through the process. I have been in that situation before where when the feedback came, one of the key feedback was for me to change my theoretical lens because the reviewer felt that theoretical lens was not in line with the conventional theoretical lens that is being used within that space. So I don't know whoever the reviewer is, but I think the point he was trying to make is everyone else have used intersectionality to explore this topic. Why are you using a different theoretical framework? So he used that as a base. Sorry, not, I shouldn't put a gender in that. The person used that as a basis to say, unless the theoretical framework is changed, then obviously they're not gonna. So because I don't want to change the theoretical framework just because everyone else is using intersectionality, I decide to withdraw the paper and submit it somewhere else. So it does help you make that informed decision about the next step as well. Okay, so let's say, for example, you want to go ahead with the revision process. For example, you've got a revise and resubmit decision, whether that's a major or minor comment. Then one thing I want to say is that the whole essence of the revision is to improve the manuscript and to ensure that it's in a position for it to be accepted. And one way to do that is to take the reviewer's feedback constructively. So I know some of us might have had that reviewer two experience where the reviewer two comment could be quite harsh. So just try as much as possible to see from a more positive light. Okay, maybe this person want me to improve the overall quality of the manuscript and take it more positively. Don't take it personal. Good. And then once you do that, it becomes really, really easy for you to then start navigating how you're going to approach the reviews. I've seen some feedback from reviewers that are like 3,000 words. So if we are now telling the authors to revise the manuscript based on a 3,000 word feedback, that's already off-putting. But if you then take it, because now that you know you're managing that expectation, if you then take it more personal, if you do not take it personally and see it as something that is developmental, then you're more likely to actually engage with the feedback as opposed to what's this? I can't just revise and submit this piece of work. I'll just send it elsewhere. So it's about taking it more constructively as well. And then the other aspect is about addressing the reviewer feedback. So if, for example, you're going ahead with the resubmission, one thing I would say is to have a separate document where you outline in detail how you've addressed the feedback, as well as in the manuscript by highlighting it to say, okay, for example, on page 5, which talks about methodology, I have addressed it, and please see it's highlighted in red. So that way it helps in the review process because sometimes I've seen situation before where a review has been sorry, a review also have addressed the reviewer's concern, but they didn't submit a cover letter to say how they've addressed it, and they just assume that we know that they've addressed it, so we've had to then send it back, which is quite frustrating on the author itself because then it's sort of um take a lot of time for them to then have to do that again, whereas they would have just done it as and when they were doing the revision. And then revise and resubmit promptly. Sometimes we do get the 3 months, or you've got 3 months to do the revision, and we just, oh, I have a lot of time, and only for you to see that the time is gone and that sort of thing. So for me, unless it's in depth in teaching or things like that, once I get a revise and resubmit, one thing I do is I look at the length of the feedback first. If it's something that is really detailed, I just sort of, okay, have at the back of my mind that, okay, I'm going to work on this over the weekend, as the case may be. But I try as much as possible to do it promptly, unless if, for example, things like health reasons or things like that occurs. And then if that's the case, then I do let the journal know to ask for extension of time as appropriate. So if you see that you're not able to do it within the time frame, they're quite understanding. You might want to drop them an email to say, please, can you shift the deadline a bit more? Because the thing is, if the person doesn't do that, what that then leads to is that if they take, for example, Jonah gave you 3 months to a revision, and then you leave that for 12 months, it will be considered as a new submission because obviously a lot of time have passed. It's in very rare cases I've seen journals that have allowed you to then revise that specific piece of work and submit when such a long period of time have elapsed. So to avoid that, I always encourage, if you can, to revise and resubmit promptly. Okay, sorry, I've eaten up a lot of the question and answer time. So in conclusion, what I would say is publishing obviously constitutes an integral aspect of the research dissemination process. And like I said, the journal is just one means of actually disseminating your work. There are other mechanisms. So it's not a case of you must publish in a journal, but it's just one way. And I just want to speak to that because I know that's one aspect that people are really keen to get their work disseminated in, especially considering the fact that you do have the advantage of that peer review process to refine your work. And then I think the key aspect to consider when selecting the appropriate journal would be, for example, what you're trying to do and to look for the most appropriate outlet that fits closely to that, because then that will then inform whether or not you would go to that specific journal. Because there is no point submitting a manuscript in a journal that does not cover the scope of the topic that you're trying to address. And then complying with the journal requirements, that's one thing I would always encourage because it does save you a lot of stress as well. Okay, and I would end with actually staying positive regardless because rejection is normal. We do know that from the academic discipline that we're in, that you get a lot of rejection, but don't let that put you off to say, oh, actually, I'm not interested in publishing. Let that be the fuel that makes you want to actually disseminate your work. Thank you.